And a big welcome to our live audience for Digital Health Investor Talk. I'm your host, Stephen Wardell. I'm the managing partner of Wardell Advisors, a digital health advisory firm, and the author of The Future of Digital Health. Wardell Advisors is helping digital health companies address issues around growth, fundraising, trade sales, and strategic alternatives, giving you more options in today's environment. You can follow me at x.com/Stephen Wardell. Our show today is on the topic of what digital health sectors are hot now. And our guest is Adam Kaufman, the publisher of Bearing on Health and an adjunct professor of economics at USC. You can follow him on LinkedIn/AD Kaufman. This show is being recorded and will be included in our podcast series called the Digital Health Investor Talk Show. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple and Spotify, and please leave us a review. We have new podcast links for the show, so make sure you see recent episodes when you subscribe, or you could be on an old page of the podcast. This is not investment advice, and we are not investment advisors. Here's the format for today's show. It's about 90 minutes, and Adam and I will spend the first part discussing the news and the macro picture and some other topics, and then we'll focus for the second part on our special topic of the day. And we'll be taking your questions throughout the show, and so feel free to type the questions in the LinkedIn chat. So, Adam, welcome to the show, and please introduce yourself.
Well, Steve, thank you for having me. I'm getting spoiled. These are semi-regular now, our ability to connect on a podcast. So thank you for that. So you mentioned it, Adam Kaufman. I'm an adjunct professor of economics at USC. I publish a newsletter, and my day job is mostly advising a combination of pharma, med tech, and digital health companies, and then spend actually most of my time with large health systems. So just finishing a interim role at Baylor Scott & White, and really enjoy getting a chance to see across the spectrum of digital health and healthcare more broadly.
Great, and thanks for joining us. So at first, we'll look at macro news. The digital health sector has had to care about macro news for a while because when the Fed raised rates radically 2.5 years ago, that sort of brought an end to our party. And ever since then, we've had to pay a lot more attention to macro news. So today, the Fed cut rates by 25 basis points, and they're in a cutting cycle right now. But the Fed chairman issued kind of a cautionary note. Now, the stock market and the innovation economy both want him to cut rates. But so why wouldn't he? Well, the issue is that if he hasn't dealt with inflation and he cuts rates, then inflation could come roaring back. So the Fed was cautious in giving the market what it wanted today, a 25 basis point rate cut, but saying that we might see a slowing down of the cutting cycle in the future. And last I checked today, the Dow was down 400 points on disappointment on this outlook. The NASDAQ was down 2% to 19.8 thousand. So, by the way, that tells us that if 2 years ago the NASDAQ was at 10,000, and so this tells us that if all you had done 2 years ago was put your money in the NASDAQ, you would have doubled it by now, and everyone would think that you're a stock market genius. And I guess I would say I tend to look at these issues from the perspective of the innovation economy. And in the innovation economy, we would like to see a strong cutting cycle. And so this is a disappointment to us. And it makes me less confident that we will see investment levels come roaring back. So my own view is that in the first and second quarters, we'll see the level of venture stage investment in digital health as defined by number of deals in seed A and B increased by 25%. That would be a big step up, and we're due for a step up like that because we're in a cutting cycle, because stock market levels are at record highs. We haven't seen that in the last 2 quarters, which has been a big disappointment, and this makes me less confident that we'll see this step up in the future. So, Adam, any reflections on this? Any other macro news? And for our audience, feel free to ask questions in the comments.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There was a great piece, some of you probably follow Michael Greeley from Flare Capital, who covered the amount of debt or sort of like lease commitments health systems have and the sort of the bond holdings. And so it's just a reminder that our biggest customers in healthcare, which are the providers themselves, and particularly the big health systems, are very tied to interest rates just in terms of capital budgets and things like that. So I think it's absolutely true that what you're saying about interest rates impacts I'm not as convinced, although it's probably because I'm not a student, that direct investing in a given quarter into the innovation economy is as interest rate sensitive. I think it probably flows from demand and exits, which are more there. And I tend to agree with you. It feels like it's been in the trough. But also when we get to the trends, I'm not sure I'm seeing a lot of things. And then in particular, when we talk about just uncertainty with the change in political administration, that you're going to see as an uptick investing at least earlier in the year than, as maybe we had hoped.
Yeah, interesting. And I follow. There's a podcast called the All In Podcast, which is the number one business podcast in the country, and they had a segment discussing what they call a bifurcation in venture investment. Since we're talking about that topic now, and bifurcation was that if you have a Gen AI startup, it's party time across the whole of the economy, not just in healthcare. And if you don't, then times are still tough, like they've been for the last year or 2.5 years. So I don't know if you're seeing that as well. But it was interesting. I noticed that in digital health, and it was interesting to see them talk about that across B2B and B2C as well.
Yeah, I think it's true. I'm not quite as close to the direct investing as I used to be. But again, to pick smart people that I think a lot of us listening to this podcast read, Christina Farr had a good article just in the beginning of the month about sort of, if you don't have AI in your pitch, you're not getting funded, and if you do, you get it, and sort of what that meant, not only for the bifurcation, but just sort of the kind of cliff that's going to happen to some of the AI companies as well. So I think it's likely true. We'll get into it more. Just my personal take, having watched what we're doing at health systems, is I think it may take a little longer to get AI into the care broadly, but I think it is going to be likely as transformational as people are describing.
Yeah, interesting. And to build on that a little bit, it's not enough to say we use generative AI to code faster to build our software product. That's not enough. You need to be going after one of the big, difficult problems in healthcare. And ideally, it's over on the administrative side as opposed to the clinical side, ironically. And that's because of a lack of trust when it comes to the clinical side. So it could be taking notes for a doctor. That is more administrative. It could be billing. That's more administrative, for example. And you can use Gen AI for diagnosis, but that's not trusted right now. And so it needs to be a core part of your product, not just a peripheral part. And it needs to be significantly better than what's currently on offer. What's currently on offer is often pretty good. You have automation using algorithms that's been around and being improved over time for a while. And so you need to have discovered that using a next gen generative AI product that you're delivering something better. So in that pitch. Well, moving on now to business news and trade journal news. And for our audience, feel free to throw a question and a story you'd like for us to comment on in the chat. But I was intrigued to see that Redesign Health, which is an incubator in New York that produces quite a large number of new startups products to meet market demand, and which does them almost entirely internally. So they're not really a venture fund; they're more of an incubator. They raised $175 million to scale their venture building, and they raised it from Declaration Partners, Euclidean Capital, and True North Advisors. So this is interesting. First of all, you don't see deals like this much at all. Usually incubators are small. They don't put their own money into companies. They go and help companies raise money from other venture investors. So Redesign Health is a unique bird out there, and I wish them luck, and I'm glad to see them raising money. And they've raised this money from these three funds I mentioned. I don't see their names investing in digital health much. So this is a matter, I think this is a New York thing. New York is the world capital of finance. And I think they've figured out a way to tell their story to investors who are not digital health venture funds and say, put your money with us and we'll create some new digital health products with it. So it's an unusual fundraise. It would be hard for anyone else to go to those same investors, duplicate this kind of fundraise. And this is after we heard a bit about Redesign Health over the last 2 years, cutting back and laying off some bad news. So not clear how it went from that retrenchment to this new large, I would call this a very large fundraise. Good for them. And they also listed some themes. I think that's really interesting for them to put out public themes. But before I'll just call out some of those themes. But before I do that, Adam, any thoughts on on this impressive fundraise by Redesign?
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to one. I think they've done some really good work. They've built some companies. I've known them off and on and admire the people there, but also the challenge there is in building digital in healthcare and how folks there's a little bit of a playbook. I hope it's true. Having been an entrepreneur and watched this, you always wonder, can you take the same thing and repeat it, or is there some secret sauce in each business? That said, they've had success getting their companies to the next stage. Some of them have retrenched in the next rounds after they've raised, but the early incubators, accelerators job is to get you to the series A or B. And I think they've done a good track record there.
And so here's some of their themes. I always love this kind of stuff here. So one is addressing the healthcare labor shortage. So that could be by automating or by staffing or by helping people get and retain their license. And that's been a really big theme. A lot of people, there's never been enough young skilled people going into the skilled healthcare labor market. And with COVID, that shook things up and made things harder. And it caused a lot of the workforce to want more flexibility. Providers don't always want a labor force that wants flexibility. They have to hire two people and give them partial jobs or whatever. And so that's what I would definitely call that out. And then preparing for an aging population. The AARP has been banging this drum forever, and there's a lot of opportunities there in preparing for an aging population. Oftentimes, those are consumer-oriented opportunities if you're just preparing for an aging population. And usually digital health companies are not pursuing the consumer market. So I'm curious if they found some angle here in the healthcare system, which is more of a regulated reimbursed system than the consumer market is. So those are some of the angles of Redesign Health. Any of their themes, resonate with you, Adam?
Yeah, and Steve, I apologize. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think that the video froze momentarily, but I'm glad you can hear me. I think they all resonate. I mean, I think we're looking at a moment, a combination of the cost increases, a combination of the redesign of work outside of healthcare, and just the huge kind of dependency on various levels of skill and training showing up to a physical location, and that being the primary cost in healthcare itself. That sort of whole interaction is ripe for redesign, to use the name. Exactly how that plays out, given those are complicated systems. There's state regulations and licensure. There are unions involved, and how that sort of transformation of the healthcare work plays out is a little less clear to me, but I'm glad to hear smart people are thinking about it and trying to improve it.
Yeah, some of the other themes, just for the benefit of our audience, I'll call out accelerating value-based care, advancing healthcare interoperability. That's a good theme. It's almost a bad joke, though, because we've been talking about advancing healthcare interoperability for something like 20 years.
Well, we're still advancing it.
And eliminating barriers to health equity, expanding sites of care. That's interesting. There's been this major trend first to go with all virtual clinics and then to reinvent hybrid clinics and just somehow have a more efficient model of care, sometimes virtual and then sometimes still needing a bricks and mortar clinic, and growing the insured populations, and then driving healthcare personalization and consumerization. So those were the themes that Redesign Health just raised $175 million on. So a big story, Adam, is that Walgreens, it was rumored for a week that Walgreens might be acquired by private equity, and now they've announced they've agreed to be acquired by Sycamore Partners. Walgreens in the recent past has seen its public market valuation plummet from $100 billion to below $8 billion. This is part of just tremendous turmoil, I think, for pharmacies. You've had retrenchment at Walmart, which is one of America's biggest pharmacies, retrenchment at Walgreens, retrenchment at CVS, bankruptcy and retrenchment at Rite Aid. And there's a number of threads here. One is that people aren't going into retail stores as much. People are saying, well, just have it mailed to me. And that means that some of the drivers of profitability for what they might have gone into a local retail store for have gone away. So that's one issue, is that your neighborhood pharmacy is being cherry picked. So there's certain ways that they make money. and they don't make a lot of money on your average prescription, but they might on a on an on patent prescription or on a prescription that takes a little extra work, and you have online pharmacies stealing that business away. So like Roman or Hims have been doing relatively well, and somehow your local pharmacist would love to get a man talking to your local primary care physician would love to get his own patient talking to him about erectile dysfunction, and then would love to give him a prescription and then send him to their local pharmacy. And somehow that man doesn't look forward to that conversation and would rather call a stranger on the internet and get that prescription mailed to him. And so that's how some of this poaching happens. But either way, it's been tough for pharmacies. And then on top of that, CVS and Walgreens and others tried to get into primary care as well. And that's not been, I thought that was a great boon to consumers. The idea that as a consumer, that you would just, as part of your ordinary shopping, you would see your primary care physician as well. And it would be a very convenient experience. And that has also suffered setbacks as well at Walmart and at Walgreens, and I think at CVS as well. So, do you have any thoughts on this? I think it's
Yeah,
bad. It's bad
I
for
think it's a
consumers.
I think it's a really big trend. I was one of the ones I had noted as well. I think it goes back a long time. There's actually a CNN article titled, "Why is your local pharmacy closing?" I think the big chains were able to buffet themselves a little bit better, and it was really the mom and pop pharmacies that have been closing for a decade. I think the quote I saw is 1 in 3 retail pharmacies have closed or will be closing over the last decade. I think there's some of the standard stuff you pointed out of retail moving online, how real it is. The stores, I think, point to shoplifting. I think it's challenging in general. From a digital innovation economy, the failure of pharmacies and retail health, I think, is a bigger issue. I think they're related. I think the pharmacy maybe thought moving into care provision could do that and sort of stay some of that reduction in the retail business. That has been, I think, failure is probably the appropriate word. I mean, Walmart just closed it, as you said. Village MD is struggling. I think CVS is struggling with the Oak Street acquisition. And I think that's a really big deal. I mean, I think the redesign of primary care is one of those things we've been talking about for a long time. And one of the thoughts was it's going to move into a easier, cheaper retail setting, and it hasn't. I would argue that that's a really big deal for digital innovators for 2 reasons. One, obviously, that change in and of itself brings opportunity. Those companies were buying, they're kind of different buyers than the average health system. So there was sort of like a first order opportunity to work with those. A lot of companies had figured out how to do business with Walgreens or CVS or Walmart. And then I would say, having been inside health systems, that transformation was actually one of the things I was pushing health systems to be more innovative. They just thought of who's going to own a relationship to a patient. And so not all of them will pull back, but if that competitive sort of competitive approach isn't there anymore, they might be less inclined to do things that, were done in defensive maneuvers against that. So I actually think that's a really big deal and will work its way through digital innovators. Not all of them, but a number of them were sort of built on the redesign of primary care into a retail setting.
Yeah, interesting. And I think Walmart had an intriguing story about this, and I don't understand why the other giant chains are having trouble. But in Walmart's case, if you carve out a piece of a Walmart store and put a pharmacy in it, that boosts sales across the entire store. So people come in, drop off their prescription, shop for 30 minutes, come back, prescription's ready, pick it up. And if you put a primary care practice, and by the way, this is also true of putting an optician in Walmart and some other businesses in a Walmart. But if you put a primary care practice, they measured it over time and it didn't boost sales for the rest of the store. So Walmart is simply saying we're going to give that space to something else that can boost sales in the rest of the store. So that's probably unique to Walmart. It's not necessarily what's going on elsewhere. And then also I think that we have seen a number of healthcare companies do poorly in public markets and be taken private. And perhaps the biggest is now Walgreens, to have been a formerly public company, to do poorly and be taken private. So I think we may see, where somehow the market's not appreciating Walgreens. Maybe Walgreens stumbled. They said we can be a tech company and a growth company, and then they stumbled. And and public investors didn't like the story. But the private markets are surprisingly large and efficient, and they can take Walgreens private and extract value from it their way. So I think that we'll see some go. I think this is part of a trend. We'll see more go privates, and some of those will be failed companies. I think Walgreens is not quite a failed company, and other ones will be just unappreciated companies. So, and I think Walgreens falls into that category. So then, I saw two mergers, both international in flavor. I'm sorry, one of them. I mean, just the first one. So it was Toronto-listed Healwell AI buying New Zealand-based Orion Health for $115 million. Orion Health is a health data management solutions company. JP Morgan advised the deal. The merge co will trade on the Toronto Exchange like the acquirer co. Healwell AI is on the Toronto Exchange. And they bought the company for its free cash flow and its large enterprise customers. So this is interesting because we just haven't seen a lot of acquisitions, and that is probably driven by young, fast-growing companies formerly having very high valuations, and that meant that the consolidators didn't want to buy these very high valuation young small companies, and that was followed by the current liquidity crisis and slowdown that we're in right now of the Fed raising rates. But many people are predicting that we'll see more acquisitions in the future as target companies' valuations right size. And this could be an example of that, where Orion Health was trading at a good valuation. I believe it was public on the New Zealand exchange at the time. And so Toronto-based Healwell acquired them. We may see these may start working. We may see more of these. Intriguingly, we may see young AI companies go public and grow fast and trade at high valuations, and then buy existing companies to backfill that are not trading at high multiples, to sort of backfill and give them capabilities. We haven't seen that to date, but that would be an intriguing dynamic that would give us new consolidators. Instead of just having old established companies be the consolidators, you could see some of these AI companies that rapidly achieve high valuations go public and then acquire older companies to sort of backfill some revenue and cash flow for them. And then a staffing company, Aya Healthcare, acquired another staffing company, Cross Country Healthcare, for $615 million, enabling it to expand the number of roles it provides staffing for and expand into all 50 states. So staffing's a hot sector. I'm not surprised to see some consolidation. It's maturing. I'm not surprised to see some consolidation in it. So these three deals, Walgreens Health, Healwell AI, and Aya Healthcare, that we usually don't see three deals happening in rapid succession. So this is signaling to me that something's freeing up in the financial markets, and that's a good sign. We want there to be an active, strong consolidation market in digital health, and see some companies get sold and some exit.
Are you hearing some feedback? Is that mine? I apologize to the people. Is that?
Yeah.
Steve, are you hearing it? Or?
I think I'm still hearing a little bit.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to adjust all the audio. I apologize. So hopefully it'll clean up.
Oh, sure. But Adam, M&A deals on these two.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you a question about that first, and then I can provide. What's your take on the IPO kind of window? I think there's a mix of sort of like there's a couple companies that have been sitting that are kind of ready to go. But the public market, digital health companies have not done great. I think a lot of that is SPAC, but even some of the ones that went public before. Your take on where things are in the public market, particularly as that now relates to a thesis of some companies that go public use their equity to do that. I'd love your take on that.
Yeah. So the IPO window is closed, and digital health and public markets are risk off, meaning that earnings negative companies are not going to get all the credit they sometimes get if they're sometimes you can have fast growing earnings negative companies that get high valuations on the street. Today it's a risk off environment. They're not going to get those high valuations. And digital health is a little out of favor unfortunately, in part because some IPOs and some SPACs performed poorly. They were down, some down 80% or more, having burned the kinds of buyers who buy IPOs and buy those kinds of stocks and causing them to be averse to the sector. So that's bad news. Now, what we are looking for, and there's many digital health companies that have achieved unicorn status, and their investors would like to see them IPO, and they can't IPO because the window's closed. So PitchBook published recently, they said that they would expect to see ZocDoc, Ro, Hinge, Omada, Everly, Noom, Lyra, Devoted, and Somatus go public. By the way, that sounds like a great list to me. I'd love to see them go public. And we also saw some filings being done with the SEC being done by Omada and Hinge, which usually signals that they've got a team in place who's thinking of going public. But what they're waiting for is a large, high quality company to go public and be well received by investors, have the stock price go up 15% and stay up and get treated well in the aftermarket by investors. And then I think you'll see, when that happens in tech and healthcare, that you'll see boards give CEOs the green light at many unicorn companies to start spending the money to begin the process to go public. So if only and I think we'll see attempts to open the IPO window in the first and second quarters of this year, and they could be successful. They could be successful because there's some high quality private companies that could go public and set the tone, and because buyers want to buy high quality IPOs, and because market indices are at record highs, and because the IPO has been closed for a long time and is due to open eventually. So, and when that happens, that will be a very good thing for the innovation economy, because you'll have investors will harvest, and some of that money will be put back into early stage funds in digital health.
And I think if you think about consolidation, my translation of that in my mind is you'll see a lot of consolidation in companies that are not doing great at low valuations, either because some, merged company is positioned better or it's a tuck-in. But I don't think you'll see likely a lot of, strategic, I don't call it overpay, but premium payment, until that IPO window opens and there's proof that these companies can achieve those multiples that would make buyers pay for it. So I think what you're going to see is, unfortunately, the lower end of the market of folks who, are coming to the end of their capital and don't have a lot of strategic options, are willing to take, decent price, but it's not a premium price. And so you're going to be trading in folks who, aren't going to have great exits until we prove that, there is an opportunity for them and someone's willing to pay that premium.
Yeah, so we may be seeing an uptick as evidenced by recent deals, but it's not a frothy M&A market. Unfortunately, it'll be. I think you'll see, it'll be a buyer's market. So then I thought it was very interesting to see that Amazon has a service called Amazon Health Services, where consumers can go to the Amazon site and find out about health services. And Hinge has just listed on Amazon Health Services. And so you can go there, and Hinge only makes its product available, which has a musculoskeletal back pain product. It only makes it available to people who are qualified because of their employer or health plan. And so the Amazon site helps you sort out whether you have coverage and then helps make it available to you. So that was just interesting to see how Amazon is engaging with the public. And then next is also Amazon announced its Nova Gen I product. I think this was a new announcement of a generative AI product. And it's claiming that it's charging 75% less for its AI compute than competitors. So this is now like we saw Microsoft versus Google versus Amazon offer web services with hosting and compute and et cetera, and get into a war, a pricing war. And now we're seeing a Gen AI pricing war with Amazon's Nova compute product. And Amazon, its healthcare assets include Amazon Clinic, One Medical, Amazon Web Services used by many healthcare companies, and Health Omics. And so we might see Amazon's Nova product built into those internal offerings.
And don't forget Amazon Pharmacy, which is a very real.
Yeah. Well, any other business news or trade journal stories, Adam, you want to bring
Yeah,
to our audience?
yeah. These are sort of more trends, but I think there's two things that I'm following that I'd love to put on your radar. So one is been interesting to see continued health system interest in building or investing in companies or funds that build products. So yeah, two new health systems joined Aegis Ventures just in the last month or so. I think in mid-November it was announced. And then something that I had a chance to learn a little bit about and watch while I was at Baylor is the launch of Longitude Health, which is a similar kind of structure that is today has four big health systems involved. The talent at both these organizations is incredible. And so, these are real moves by health systems to continue to foster the kind of the digital innovation economy in healthcare, but do it in ways that are closer to what they're doing. So I just think it's interesting that, those were two announcements that came out in the last month or so.
That's great. So hospitals are rumored to be feeling very cash constrained, kind of poor right now, but they are nevertheless finding the cash to put into corporate venture funds, which is great. It's great that they're keeping that
Yeah,
up.
and I think it's probably fair to separate, the vast majority of community hospitals, which are incredibly cash constrained, from 20, 30 large health systems that are a mix of hospitals, physician groups, ambulatory surgery centers, often payers, and they come at it from delivery, but they're diversified and big in a way that the big payers look like as well. So they're doing okay. The other trend, and I'd first heard about it a couple months ago, but I've heard about it a lot lately, and so I'd love your take if you're familiar. I think the people are pronouncing the acronym ICRA, but the individual coverage health reimbursement arrangements, which is this idea that pre-tax dollars from an employer can go into basically a fund that allows an employee to purchase an individual coverage. And so it's still employer sponsored, but it's not actually a group plan. And one of the recent announcements was Centene, which does not have much of an employer business at all, or if at all, is going big in their exchange product and better into ICRA kinds of accounts. And a couple of the fundings we've seen over the last months or so have been early stage, but firms building services for employers to manage ICRA. There are some estimates, that this could climb to a significant, multiple tens of percents of employer sponsored care within a reasonable time. And that would dramatically change the way we think about who is the buyer and who's delivering healthcare if essentially employers are giving you money to go spend on an individual product.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. So I like the sound of that because I think it would give employees more options, create more competition. That sounds good. I'm not very familiar with the story though, but thank you. Well, great. So then the next area I think I would mention is, so now we move into the technology portion of our show. Is there any technology or Gen AI product that has improved your life? And this is for the benefit of our audience. And so I'll mention two I think are intriguing. The first is that the new iPhones have what's called an action button. And a lot of people tie the action button to voice recording or to camera or to tasks. But another thing you can do is you can tie the action button to opening ChatGPT to its verbal layer. And then you can, so that you're walking along, you can press the action button on your iPhone. Probably you can do this with Android phones as well. And then you're talking to ChatGPT while you're mobile, while you're walking down the road, while you're not looking at the screen. So I found that to be an intriguing possible lifestyle change there. And then the second is, in the past, I've talked about buying a separate screen for your laptop. And this time I'll mention that a PC can treat an iPad as a second screen. A laptop can treat an iPad as a second screen with software called Duet software. So I've got that as well. And I actually run three screens off of my laptop. It's native screen, and then my iPad that I bring with me, and then I bring a compact single purpose screen as well. And so you can have three screens in your hotel room or whatever. So those are two technologies that have improved my life. So Adam, any thoughts from you about, or any comment on that, or thoughts from you about technology that's improved your life?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look into that iPad. I think last time I was on, I talked about connecting the screen and how that changed. And it's not digital, so I feel bad. But as we're approaching ski season, and some of I'm a Southern Californian, so I don't like cold. I've invested in a lot of battery powered clothing. So you can get that because we've it's gotten batteries so small. You can get a vest, you can get pants, you can get gloves, you can get socks. And so, it's, I guess, the modern equivalent of being an Iron Man, or maybe the opposite, which is I only have to worry about a bunch of batteries. So that'd be my tech, not digital. But for those of you, in the cold weather, I've used them before, and they really work. And
So does that
they're
mean
relatively affordable.
So we associate cold skiing with wearing all this puffy clothes, multiple layers of puffy clothes. So does that mean that your clothes are thinner, but you're actually warmer?
Thinner, warmer, or less of it. So instead of having the underlayer and then a middle layer, and then you get the middle layer, because they tend to be like a fleece material, because they're essentially running cable through it that heats up, but you don't need another layer. So you can wear that if it's fine. They're typically not built into the shell, so you still want the waterproof piece, but you don't need 2 or 3 layers. You just turn on the heat depending on how cold it is.
That's interesting. I remember decades ago, there was a big trend of people having electric blankets in their beds at night. And I don't know why that trend faded, but this seems like the next generation of that is that you don't need to plug them into the wall. You can carry a battery around and then they warm up your clothes.
Exactly. So now instead of carrying like a lot of extra clothing when I go skiing, I carry like a pack of batteries and chargers, and you got to make sure everything's plugged in at night. You trade one hassle for another, but it's a lot less space and easier.
And then I've also seen that in the world of young techies, they have chosen for the roller bag in travel and the fleece jacket to be the home of the charging battery. And so instead of having a spare battery in your pocket or maybe loosely in your shoulder bag, it goes into a specific spot in your jacket. And then you also thread charging cords around in it. So now you've got your phone and you've got your invisible wires leading to your charging battery. And then you're even threading your, if you have corded headphones, you're threading your corded headphones in it. But then also with your roller bag, it's got a battery in it. And so when you're near a power source, you plug your roller bag in to charge your roller bag. And then when you're away from the power source, you plug your phone and laptop into your roller bag to get its power. So I've seen that has to do with charging mobile devices, not heat.
I think you can use some of this heated clothing as well, because I think some of them have a similar battery, so you just plug in a different USB connector. But yeah, that's interesting. If I need a new pair of glasses, just normal prescription. I am very interested if anyone online send me separately, or if you get any comments, if anyone's using like the Meta Ray-Bans or any of the other smart eyeglasses, because I'm very interested in that use case. And since I need a new pair anyway, I'm trying to decide whether it's time to jump into that tech yet or not.
Interesting. Yeah. So anyone in the audience, feel free to comment in the chat, and I'll pass it on to Adam. And in the audience, if you are using a technology that is an affordable technology, you can put it in the chat. I'll bring it to the attention of our audience. And Adam, it's not exactly high tech, but I got Warby Parker glasses, and I liked the experience all in all, because at that moment where you think you've lost your glasses, you just go to Warby Parker and say, mail me another pair, and they mail it quickly and efficiently, and it's not the highest price. It's not cheap, but it's not the highest price to you. And so you're not sitting there saying, I have to bring my prescription to a retail location and get this filled there. So just the fact that they had your prescription and could mail you another pair right away was a nice feature there. So then a discussion of conferences. So the conference that everyone's talking about right now is the JP Morgan conference in San Francisco. And it's pretty late to reach out to many people for meetings, but you probably still could get meetings. People go to JP Morgan for the meetings, not the programming. And these are typically meetings where you're talking about sales or biz dev meetings with large enterprises, or alternately VC meetings about fundraising at JP Morgan. And it's the second full week of January in San Francisco. And does our audience have any conferences they want to
Real quick, I think most of the audiences, but just for those new to JP Morgan, if you're worried about like finding where to register for the conference, like very few of us actually go to the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. It's really an investment banking conference. We go around JP Morgan. So there's a number of satellite conferences, there's meetings, like people are there. For those of us who have been, it always seems to rain in San Francisco that week. So be prepared for that, and be prepared for hiking up and down the hill depending on where your meeting is. But don't worry, there's no conference registration. You're basically going to go and try to set up meetings around.
That's great. And then, so some personal notices.
Actually, real quick, if I can make a plug for conferences, it's one I just went to, but it'd been a while. I went to the Dallas Fort Worth Business Group on Health meeting. It was a great meeting, about 250 people. Mark Cuban and Cost Plus was sort of one of the presenters, being a Dallas guy. But it was just a reminder that there's some really great local conferences, and particularly for the innovators on. I'm a big believer in being very precise on where you're spending your money and time. And so the national conferences are great, but they're harder. It's kind of a little bit more shotgun. So if you have a service that is geographically tailored, you can sometimes get more out of the local conferences. So depending on who you're selling to, look at the local affiliates of the business group on health or on SHRM if it's employers, or there's tends to be a state kind of a health plan association in each state that has meetings, and they're just more accessible, they're cheaper to go to, and sometimes you can even get better interaction. So just a reminder that those are great places to be as well.
And I've heard similar things. So when you're selling to the employer benefit leader, you're trying to reach employer benefit leaders. When you're selling into hospitals, you're trying to reach the hospital CIO often. And those people are over prospected and their time is just totally booked at the national conferences. And so a lot of salespeople will say that the place that I gather information and make connections and get to meet people and build relationships is at those regional conferences for the business group on health, or regional conferences for HIMSS as well.
Yeah. And healthcare is still pretty local, particularly if you're dealing with delivery or the plans. And so, they like to know that you're there thinking about it as well. Just to remember.
So some personal notices. The next show is coming up January 8th. What will happen in employer health tech with Marcus Osborne, the former head of Walmart's health effort. And also our next live event is coming up on January 3rd at the Liberty Hotel in Boston with MIT professor Manolis Kellis on AI and drug discovery. And also, if you're going to JP Morgan, then send me a note and maybe we could meet up for a drink or something at JP Morgan as well. Adam, any personal notices in the next couple of weeks?
No, just I will be around JP Morgan also. So if you're there, let me know. Steve, maybe I'll take you up on meeting for a drink. But yeah, no, things are good. Happy holidays to everyone. That's, I guess, my personal.
Great. Well, so now we jump into the second half of the show, where our topic is what digital health sectors are hot now. What are the changing preferences of the software budgets in the major healthcare sectors? And so, there's certain budgets that usually have money to spend on tech, and their pain points and needs change over time. And so the hot products that get sold into those change over time as well. And so, one of those budgets is the provider budget. And at the provider, there's typically the hospital CIO who buys things like electronic medical records and clinical physician support tools, and the hospital CFO. And then there's certain departments that often have a budget, like the emergency department or the radiology department. And so here in the provider world, I would say that for community hospitals, they are feeling very poor right now. And a lot of their budget is locked up in multi-year contracts with the big EMR vendors, with Epic and Cerner. But an area where they are willing to spend more is in revenue cycle management. And so a way of thinking of this is that providers have underspent on revenue cycle management something like 15 years. And it's an area where very often when they're buying new revenue cycle management, they're replacing inefficient internal processes. And and the vendors can promise a real hard financial ROI effects with the purchase of their revenue cycle management solution here. So providers, can justify spending more on revenue cycle management. And in the last 2 years, there's actually been a boom of using generative AI in revenue cycle management, and it really works, and it really is better than the alternative. So another issue in revenue cycle management is that you need these employees that are called coders, medical coders. They are not software coders, they're medical coders. And a number of these not enough young people have gone into this category of employment over time. And a number of the older people retired during the COVID crisis. And so there's just a lack of medical coders. And so Gen AI has stepped into this gap with a growing number of products that do a really good job of interpreting medical notes and translating that into coding notes, which then allows the hospital to quickly and directly submit that as a bill to payers. And so this is an intriguing case where Gen AI is really working. And as a result, there have been a number of entrants, Codemetrics, Maverick, and others that are racing to fill this demand. Different parts of the hospital bill differently. And so there's different Gen AI solutions. And so that's a hot area in the provider category selling into the CFO. Adam, any thoughts on that or other categories
Yeah,
of
just
provider?
wanted to highlight something I think really important, that you touched on, but maybe not as explicitly. So some of this is also kind of, for lack of a word, business model innovation. I'm almost skeptical to call it just because it's been around a long time. But there is this CFO budget that is like, a license budget hitting the OpEx yearly. But revenue cycle management and even a lot of other companies have figured out how to actually position it as a service or as like we'll actually take in the money and just keep a percent. So there's some innovation around what money is actually being tapped as some of these companies are selling. I'm not exactly familiar with which are doing what, but for a long time, revenue cycle has been one of those places where you essentially outsource it as a service and the people get paid as a percentage of the claims that they're processing.
That's great. So now moving on to another major category, this is payers, and payers are often commercial health plans, other payers buying tech to meet their pain points and needs. And here, I think payers have really been shocked and they feel kind of punched in the nose by CMS downgrading their scores on HEDIS scores, among other things. And this can really, if you're a general plan manager at a health plan and your plan gets downgraded on its scores by the federal government, that reduces your revenue and that hurts your career. So this is an area where there's just a lot of pain right now, and a lot of these plan managers scrambling for any kind of solution, whether it's a pure software solution or a service solution that helps them boost HEDIS scores. So this involves quality measures of healthcare. It could be as simple as getting a test at a certain age, or if you visit a provider, having the provider check several, check your weight and your blood pressure and that sort of thing. And so payers have been shown to be willing to spend money on vendors who are promising them service solutions that help them boost their HEDIS score and meet some gaps they've discovered that have caused them to be downgraded recently. So that's another area where I think in the payer market, and I think all in all, payers are not behaving like they have a lot of cash to spend on tech right now. It's not a dynamic time where payers have big piles of cash they're looking to spend on tech to reinvent themselves. But this is an area where plan managers have shown an interest in spending more on tech. So Adam, any thoughts on the payer category?
Yeah, I think like you saw in the providers, payers, essentially business is all administrative, and those are some of the best use cases for AI. So I think they're interested in that. We've obviously seen, some of the downside, particularly around kind of, automated. But, even if you put that aside, just processing based claims, figuring out internal stuff, there's a huge amount. I've had good fortune to work with some Medicaid providers. There's a huge amount of reporting that a Medicaid payer has to make to the states. So just even automating that, collecting the data in. So I think that's there. Just to echo what you said, I think I saw the estimate that employers are expecting like a 5.7 or 7, somewhere between 5 and 7% increase in medical costs, premium costs. That's mostly being driven by medical expense, but payers feel that because they're the ones who have to pass it on. So they're not sitting there with a lot of extra things to spend because they're getting pressure to control pricing.
Great, and then and by the way, there's a joke that that Gen AI is the latest, hottest, greatest technology, and that you have an arms race going on right now between providers and payers, where providers are spending more on tech to be able to submit claims a little better, and then payers are spending more on tech to figure out how to manage and deny claims a little better. And you have this growing arms race between the two. And then also, so the way I heard this version of the joke is that in the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie The Terminator, the Air Force builds a supercomputer that then wakes up one day and decides to destroy humanity. And that movie was directionally correct, but in the specifics, it's actually going to be a hospital billing AI supercomputer that wakes up and decides it's time to destroy humanity. And so we have that to look forward to. Well, so then over on the employer side, so employers buy these programmatic benefits for employees, which has been a really hot sector for a long time. An example would be an employee has back pain and they are a candidate for physical therapy and possibly even surgical intervention. And then an employer will help provide them with an online exercise program that's quite low cost and perhaps free to the employee. And this helps the employee strengthen their back, deal with fundamental issues, and changes the nature of the problem, improves it, so that maybe they can address the problem without having to go into back surgery. And that saves the employer a lot of money. That would be just one example of this. And there have been many of these solutions built up over time. Here, I would say the progressive large employers, this is a time where they're not really excited about brand new categories of products the way they often were over the last 15 years. And they're increasingly looking for an integrated suite. So they're saying, we have 35 separate contracts with point solutions. That means if the average contract length is 3 years, that means on average we're renegotiating every month one of these products. And we think we want to start buying suites, and then we want meta functionality across the suite. So we want you to pre-guarantee work with our Oracle PeopleSoft implementation, and we want you to guarantee IT security across equal IT security across all of the 7 apps in our suite. And we want single sign-on for all of them, and we want analytics across all of them, the same analytics across all of them. And we want gamification across all of them. And so this is meta functionality. And so this is advantaging the existing suites and disadvantaging point solutions. And so existing suites would be companies like Teladoc or Omada or Accolade, or any company that's gone public would have an advantage here. Castlight, has a suite. So, but I think that's a changing demand. That instead of coming to us with a point solution that would delight us with a slightly better result in a specific category of care management, let's say, they're saying instead of that, come to us with a suite that offers us and all in all, it's going to be cheaper and give us more functionality and more meta functionality and reduce the burden on our HR staff of dealing with all of these point solutions and their individual negotiations and their renewals. So, Adam, any thoughts on the employer health tech sector?
Yeah, a couple. So I think that's absolutely true. It has been true for a long time, but I think it's going to be increasingly true that for the most part, you can't scale to an employer if you can't actually bill them through the medical infrastructure. So almost all the big vendors started on what we would call the programmatic spend. So a contract with the employer, invoicing, and almost anyone who has reached scale with an individual employer, let alone multiple, have figured out how to submit a claim. And so to some extent, the employer-based providers are really just that. They are providers delivering a medical service. Often there's a little bit of, there's code sets that maybe the ASO doesn't naturally reimburse. And so the employer has to agree to cover them. But the big players in this space are providers. And some of that has been, Omada early on, both helped cause and was fortunate that there was a coding for diabetes prevention and reimbursement that drove that. Others have been creative in terms of using existing code sets and making them work for their own model. But just a reminder that the kind of actual employer business writing a check from the employer, not through their claims processing, is actually relatively small. And the big set of them have figured that claims piece out. The other thing I would say is a combination of 2 trends that are hitting employers. One, just the cost increases that have come pretty steadily since the pandemic ended. And so there's this cost sensitivity, whether that leads to things like ICRA, which we talked about. So that's one. And then 2, I think there's a real question, and Stephen, this would be interesting from a macro environment of kind of where the economy is in terms of recession and employment. We've been in an age where for most employers, keeping employees and finding employees has been a challenge. And employers then tend to think about benefits that attract and retain folks. Not every employer will switch, but if we move to an economy where it's a down economy, employers are letting people go, and we're seeing that in some sectors like defense is what a lot of people go, or in aerospace, I guess probably better said, you'll see that change some and the priorities will change. So I do think watching the macro economy, different employment segments respond differently, but in general, they move in terms of the relative market power between the employee and the employer in that employment contract drives the marginal behavior of employers.
This is a really good point, which is that there's probably been over entry in this employer health tech sector that sells into the benefit leader at the progressive large employer. There's several well-funded companies in each of the categories that sell into this employer, and we're going through a tough time right now. The market has been predicting a recession for a long time, for over a year. We didn't know when it would land, and people are thinking that maybe the spending and the wars, the two wars, Middle East and Ukraine, has delayed a recession. Usually you don't get to skip a recession, but you can delay it. And that this has delayed the recession. And so therefore, we might hit the long delayed recession in coming quarters. And if that's the case, exactly as you said, suddenly employers thinking changes. What their old thinking was, we lose $70,000 if an employee just leaves and goes to our competitor in terms of refilling that role. And so let's give them a little extra benefits. This costs $12 a year. This costs $70 a year if they use it. And let's attract and retain that talent and give them a special reason to be here and improve our morale and that sort of thing. And then when you go into a recession and there's layoffs, suddenly that becomes the time when employers can say, well, our employees are not going anywhere. They're not being made offers, and so they're not going to just leave here. In fact, we're getting rid of 10% of our employees in a layoff. And so we can just rationalize, consolidate, and cut back on these benefits. And so we could see that, and that would be coming at the worst possible time for a lot of these companies, where they're being disadvantaged in the marketplace because they can't get to a suite, but the suite companies are moving ahead, so now employers are belt tightening and cutting employees and also benefits as well. So that could be affecting this sector.
And actually, one other thing to think about for employers, we don't talk about it as much because it's much harder to sell to. There are fewer, but it is very big, the government employee sector. And, it's not the first call you make when you're an innovative company, but at some point, it's very hard to get to any scale if you don't have a school district, if you don't have a government. And unclear exactly, but at least my very limited reading of what the Trump administration is talking about is actually cutting federal employees as well. And so we may see some of those same trends into the federal employees. Less clear what happens at state and local levels, but those end up being very big anchor and important clients for most of these innovative companies in sort of the second wave of their commercial success. So, yet another thing that's going to hit companies that are focused on the employer space.
Also, this employer space, it's often called B2B2C. So you have a vendor and their first sale is to an employer like Target. But then they have to do a second sale, which is to the employee. If it's a fitness program, they have to get the employee to sign up for the fitness program and do the fitness. And so they're selling both. And this is an intriguing area for AI, I think, for generative AI. So generative AI is known, among other things, for creating good, believable chatbots. So perhaps better chatbots. So many of these products that are being sold to the employer, they touch the employee. So now you could have a new user interface. The old user interface might be visit our webpage, log in, click some radio buttons, enter some data. The new user interface might be, this is a chatbot in your text, or this is some other chatbot that we have. And that may be it can be a better or the right chatbot. Someone with diabetes managing their diabetes, life's complicated. They don't want to do this on a web page. Now they can just chat in their text chat, where they already text daily with 12 people in their text chat. Now they're texting.
I think that's right, Steve, although I would put that in maybe solving a different problem, which is this B2B2C actually brings two problems for the companies or challenges. One is the sort of eligible population to sign up. And then typically the revenue model is tied to engagement in some way. And so you're incentivized for clinical and health outcomes, but also from a business standpoint of keeping that person engaged. I absolutely agree with you. Gen AI, chat technology, multimodal approaches will keep more engagement. In my experience, the fundamental issue in terms of actually getting the sign up itself, that sort of second sale, is just getting access to the channels to put in front of employees. And I'm not sure that the growth of chat engines and employers having more stuff is actually going to make that easier for vendors. I think it's actually going to proliferate more distraction, and employers, it's hard enough, the employer sends one email a quarter about their benefits to get into that. But if there's more and there's more ways, like, I'm not sure that's actually going to help with the acquisition piece. And it's a little bit of what I think our next topic is, but I think it's why you're seeing success. And I, again, have a bias for those who may know me. I spent some time at Weight Watchers, but companies that have consumer channels and consumer brands are often more successful coming back into the employer, or employer brands are building some consumer brands because they've got to manage that employer, like the employee marketing as well.
Interesting. And I'll call out briefly. I thought that Teladoc Livongo, before the Gen AI revolution, they bragged about their AI coach for diabetes. So once you've signed up for it, you're engaging with their AI coach who has access to your data and is telling you things like you should not have dessert, or this would be a good time to go for a walk, or that sort of thing. So that was and I think they actually called it AI. So it was the ultimate buzzword, and that was pre-Gen AI. And so I think we may see not only existing vendors add this kind of capability, and it was presented as a chatbot within Livongo, but you'll also see new entrants. And this is a big threat for a lot of digital health companies, is that you'll see a new entrant company. They'll cherry pick, they'll go after the best market, and they'll build a software company that is 10 US employees and 50 employees in India, rebuilding the code stack of someone who's been around for 12 years, and doing it faster and more efficiently because they're being sort of born in the Gen AI coding wave that's going on right now.
Yeah.
So
I think that's right.
So the next category is the consumer category. So this is companies like Noom and Fitbit and what is the new wristband that everybody loves so much? Whoop.
Whoop's been around a while. Is that a hot one? I haven't followed the wristband category.
And Weight Watchers and Peloton and others. And so here, I'm not seeing sort of a new category open up, a new demand, a new trend.
Well, I think there is, if you'll allow me. So first, just before we get into it, we were remiss to not cover the Aura funding. When we talked about funding. So Aura Ring raised, I think it was 75 million from Dexcom, which is an interesting raise at a very healthy valuation. So I think just as another point, I think, so the trend I would tell you, and I think Lilly as a pharma company is the most advanced, but I have an opportunity to, sort of look behind the scenes with a number of pharma. I think this direct to consumer from pharma is a real thing. And it is essentially pharma's response to what Hims and Rowe figured out could work, right? So the original Hims and Rowe, as you pointed out, were categories that were consumer demand, probably some degree of embarrassment going, and sort of like isolated erectile dysfunction. What I think they demonstrated, and I think actually we could spend an entire show on GLP-1s if we want, but I think the GLP-1 craze has proven, I think pharma is taking to other categories, which is we're going to market you directly, and then we're going to partner with the telemedicine company that's arguably at arm's length, but you're coming because you have psoriasis or you have whatever, and they're going to actually prescribe a drug. And then we're going to, it's not pharma directly because of the anti-kickback and rules directly, but we're going to coordinate a supply chain that doesn't have to have you go anywhere physically to market to you, to see a doc, to get it prescribed, to have it dispensed. And I think that's a very real thing. I think Lilly Direct is the most advanced, but the pharma takes a little bit longer, and I'd be willing to bet you'll see more. And that's essentially the Hims and Rowe playbook now in branded medication that I think that is coming. And that is countering some of what you're seeing in the chaos of going to other groups, but it only works for certain drugs where you can carve out consumer demand. The other big trend is everybody, and Noom was the last one to announce, Weight Watchers had done it before, is in the supply of GLP-1s, not just the support and prescription of it. And I think the trend I see in the consumer space is virtual care, but actually now moving into how do I get you the physical product, which is often the med, but it could be a device, it could be other things, and sort of like full, if you thought of it as vertical integration, like a full stack kind of supplier.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard a joke going around that every healthcare story is a GLP-1 story. Whatever the story is anywhere in healthcare, there's like, only a few Kevin Bacon degrees of separation from GLP-1s. It's such a brick thrown into the lake with so many
Yeah.
ripples.
I mean, if you allow me a second, I think it's the first time in history that we've seen competition bring prices down in pharma. Like, I don't think we can understate the transformation that is happening in the GLP-1 space and its potential to disrupt how we think about it. Like, no one would have thought prior to this you could market a injectable thing broadly and build real, like it. Now, those of us who have been in weight loss could have told you, yes, in weight loss you could handle it, but I think we're seeing that is permeating others, and in large part because the manufacturers are multiple top 20 pharma. The history of weight loss drugs have been a third as effective, twice the side effects, but I think the piece that is also under thought about in that is they've generally been startup and second or third tier pharma. This is, who do you have now? Lilly and Novo. The next one's Pfizer and Amgen. Like these are companies that do not play and then leave, and they will disrupt. And then they're seeing, okay, what of that can I take to my other categories? Obviously, first in diabetes and other areas. And then because it's such a big space, all regulators, all employers, like it is the weight that I think obviously healthcare is giant and this is a small piece, but this is where most of the change is happening in the short run, particularly in the pharma, consumer facing pharma space. That's not to talk about, rare disease and expensive therapies, but so I think it is a tremendously impactful category. And we'll see only more of it over the next decade as new drugs come out and the competition changes and they sort of work their way through the system. One thing you and I will talk about in 6 months is it going to be legal to compound these things or not? And there's a real debate. They're doing it now because of a shortage. The law says you can only do it when there's a shortage, but I think Noom and Roe have some arguments that they should be able to do it for so that in and of itself will be an interesting piece of what's going on. Anyway, I've been around it long enough to be excited, but I do think you're right. It is a pull for most of healthcare right now, at least the parts of it that are changing.
Yeah, so and every consumer-oriented business around weight loss or relatedly diabetes or even things like touching on fitness has had to figure out how do we change based on GLP-1s. Are we going to
Supplements,
totally
all
lose
food, all
market?
supplements, all physical activity. I walk by GNC because it's on the way to my gym, and the GNC ad is, are you on a GLP-1? We have the right supplements for you.
Wow.
Right. So it's not here's how you get ripped anymore. It's like, oh, you're on GLP-1. So like that, the entire sort of consumer health space is I think, dramatically impacted.
Really interesting. So then the next sector is the pharma tech sector. So this is software and tech companies selling software and tech products and services into life science, pharma, med tech, etc. And so here, there's a number of areas. So pharma is feeling rich and spendy right now. And that's in contrast to most hospitals and most health plans that are feeling sort of poor and not very spendy right now. And so pharma is spending money on software. They see real value in continuing to increase the amount of software they buy. And three areas that they're spending on right now, there's automating sales. This is like Viva. And there continues to be areas where software can provide value to large sales and commercial teams. Also automating clinical trials as well. So there continues to be room for software to have value here in automating clinical trials, shortening clinical trials, decentralizing clinical trials, and then also drug discovery with AI. This must be a different kind of AI. I need to understand this area better, but I've heard a number of cases of people talking about the drug discovery budget spending more on using AI for simulation. And so what's so interesting here is that we have a growing understanding of drug targets in the body. We have a growing understanding of drug candidates and drugs. And very often it's the exact shape and the molecules. Oh, you have a carbon molecule or a hydrogen molecule here or there and so usually what drugs do is they can inhibit or they can promote something, and that is being done by the exact molecules and shape at the active site of the drug candidate and the drug target. And this was extraordinarily difficult to model in the past, but we've gotten better and better at modeling this using, I think it is spatial and graphical AI, not generative large language model AI. But there's a new generation of AI It's enabling companies to do more drug discovery in silico is often what it's called. And so you can predict that this will be a better drug candidate for most of the drug targets while still being soluble in blood and having fewer side effects. And you can do that in silico. And often what winds up happening is you generate a billion drug candidates and then you disqualify 99.9% of them, and then you wind up spending additional money in silico and also in vitro on the remaining candidates. But this is being done. So the drug discovery departments of pharma are spending more on spatial and visual AI with respect to modeling drug candidates and drug targets better. So those are areas of pharma tech spending. Adam, any thoughts on pharma and pharma tech spending?
Yeah, I find it super fascinating. As you know, pharma will talk about upstream, which is, R&D and the trials, and downstream. I'm fascinated by and loved what you just described, but not super familiar with kind of upstream pharma spend. But downstream in terms of the commercialization, I think you're absolutely right. There's been an increasing trend of it's harder to reach doc, it's harder to find them. And so things that can make that easier. The one thing I would say is there's been a couple false starts, maybe arguably even fraud in marketing to physicians over the years. And so like the actual way that pharma reaches physicians is something they're always innovating with. But I think you're absolutely right. Pharma is continuing to innovate. And just coming back to what we said about GLP-1s, there's going to be half a dozen GLP-1s for major pharma. It is going to be a huge category, and there will be some differentiation in those, but really they're going to win by a combination of the way they go to market, the way they position, the way they price. And then I would say for the innovators, these companies are starting to think about digital companions. And for those who don't know, the new kind of regulatory framework is called PDURS. I've actually blanked as I'm saying it on what that stands for, but basically it allows you to have software that is not a companion app, meaning you have to have done a trial simultaneously with the medication and it's like joint label, but not just like a patient services. It can be on the pharma label, but it's done separately. And so I think pharma is starting to think about digital connections in that way to differentiate what they're doing, at least in crowded spaces where, there's a different side effect, but they need to do it. Interesting category.
Yeah, I what you said just generated some other thoughts in me. So you're right that pharma is always playing a game of sort of try to reach the doctor somehow. And over time, a growing number of doctors don't work for themselves; they work for institutions. Those institutions have actually tried to shut pharma sales reps out in some cases. And so the latest pharma interest is somehow getting into the EMR. And so pharma is going to great lengths to figure out how to get into the EMR in some way through a clinical decision support tool or an e-prescribing tool or something like that. And so pharma is willing to spend money that way. Also, the companion apps or tightly paired apps to drugs as well. There's some spending on that. So that's
And one thing to watch that we didn't cover, and it's going to be legal and regulatory, but there's been this simmering and now I think kind of actually, bubbling over about PBMs and how drugs are sold and priced and all that. If nothing changes, it won't. But if somehow with the stroke of a pen, the federal government rationalizes that process, there's going to be a scramble to understand how do you actually manage costs and rebates and get things in front. And so, that'll be disruptive, but also it's always an opportunity for innovators to think about how to do that better. So the whole drug distribution piece has been kind of a staid part that we've all just accepted, that I think whether it's direct to consumer, the regulatory challenges on PBM or like Amazon Pharmacy and others is disrupting. So another area to pay attention that pharma's obviously watching as well.
And then last, we get to the category of FDA risk. So this is software and tech companies that make products that are subject to FDA clearance or approval, and that then are often sold as medical devices or software as a medical device, or even as prescription digital therapeutics in the marketplace. And here, let's see, I think it's been a tough story the last 2 years. We've seen a number of problems happen with Pear and Achille and other companies. So Pear ran out of money. Achille chose to go down the consumer pathway, but not the prescription pathway for its ADHD solution. And so let's see, I think I have not seen, young companies come out with very not so. The fundamental strength of this category is the idea that software is a new modality that will have unique kinds of efficacy in certain areas like neuro or other areas in healthcare. So just as small molecule, we expect small molecule to be able to do certain things well and other things not well. And large molecule, we expect large molecule to be able to do certain things well and other things not well. Software and tech as a modality, we'd expect to be able to do certain things well and other things not well. And so here, I don't see an area where that's innovative in the last 2 years where I think we're gonna see a lot more spend by doctors choosing advanced products, let's say, than other areas. So FDA risk, Adam, any thoughts on this category where?
Yeah, I think there's been a couple things. I think I'm forgetting the name now. I'm trying to remember. But there's the sort of the mental health approval to actually build digital therapeutics and mental health that just came out. So I think that's a positive. It's going to take a while. It's not exactly clear to most folks. I think it was modeled after the RPM and RTM, so it's not quite as good as a drug. Then we got some news that was it Maryland Medicaid declined to cover Freespira and Canvas DX. So that was a little bit disappointing. I think to your point, I know we're short on time, but I think the challenge for software as a kind of pharma model has been those work because there are distinct mechanisms of action embedded in the structure, right? So small molecule works, but it has a mechanism. For the most part, what we've done in software is take existing mechanisms, mostly coaching or therapy, and deliver them through software. And so they end up, whether you end up getting them kind of a code, that they end up feeling like they're replacements for providers, not for devices or for products, which isn't a problem. But then you end up in they're reimbursed as CPT codes. You don't get individual things. The pricing is much lower. They're harder to scale. And there are a couple very, very unique cases. We didn't talk about it. It's more of a device, but their software like Cala just raised a bunch of money to do tremor because they're actually able with the device that is digital in nature also to actually control tremors in a way that couldn't. The example I always like to use is people are training like eyes that have damage using actual kind of software kinds. So when we have digital mechanisms of action, I think we'll see it, but those are unique to each of those things. It's not a broad category as much. And so the good news is we are seeing more coding, we're seeing more reimbursement, but I think it is tended to look like provider style CPT codes, DME kinds, and not pharma, which means often lower reimbursement, harder dispensing, and a kind of a trickier competitive environment than if you got a unique pharma style code.
That's great, really interesting. Well, thank you. And do you have any last comments or summary for our audience on today's thoughts on the sort of the changing nature of the pain points of the budgets that spend for health tech?
No, I mean, it was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me. If we did it again in 3 months, we'd probably have different things to say, although I think a lot of it is stable as well. So I appreciate the opportunity.
That's great. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming on. And so you've been listening to Digital Health Investor Talk with your host, Steve Wardell, and thanks to our guest, Adam Kaufman. We are publishing this show as part of the Digital Health Investor Talk show. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and don't forget to rate us. Our next show is on Wednesday, January 8th, What Will Happen to Employer Health Tech with Marcus Osborne, the former head of healthcare at Walmart. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. And thank you, Adam.
My pleasure. Thank you.